going to continue talking what I was speaking of yesterday. I'm going to talk about George Washington. Now, why are we doing this? Because we have an election in 5 days, and an election for president. And I want to show you what God gave us as our first president. If you will turn with me to Isaiah 3. We spoke to this yesterday, but it's talking to the Jewish people, and it's telling them about what God had taken away from them. It says, "For behold, the Lord of hosts," verse 1, "take away from Jerusalem and from Judea the stay and the staff, the whole stay of bread and the whole stay of water." And now look what God took away from them because they would not obey him. It says, "The mighty man." God took away from the midst of Israel the mighty man and the man of war and the judge and the prophet. They wouldn't obey him. He took away the prophet and the prudent and the ancient and the captain of 50 and the honorable man and the counselor and the cunning artificer and the eloquent orator. Now, I want us to look at that. In verse 3, it says, he took away from them the honorable man. The honorable man. Now, I want to talk a little bit today about George Washington and about after the war. I spoke yesterday about George Washington being the man of war. And he was. He was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Do you know that war lasted 8 years? 8 years. World War II lasted 5. The War for Independence lasted 8 years. And at the end of those 8 years, Washington, being commander-in-chief, resigned as being commander-in-chief. On December 23rd, I think it was 1783, Washington resigned right after the Treaty of Paris, right after we became a new nation. Why did he do that? Do you know that Congress during that war granted Washington rights and authority that nobody else had? And he could have taken that authority. He had the authority of a dictator. He could do anything that he needed to do to get through this war. And at the end of that war, instead of keeping that authority and becoming a dictator, he resigned. He resigned. He resigned his commission as general commander-in-chief. And he did it on purpose. He did it on purpose. His heart was toward the republic. Now, I don't know if you understand, if you remember in high school and in junior high, the United States from the very onset was a republic. It wasn't a democracy. It was a republic. What's the difference? Democracy, everybody gets a vote and you decide from everybody voting. In a republic, you vote for representatives and then they vote. And they make the laws. And that's what we had set up. That's what started with the Declaration of Independence. That's what started with the Articles of Confederation. Washington resigned. When he resigned, he only had one request. He didn't ask for any money. He didn't ask for anything. The only thing he requested was, he said, you have people, you have your soldiers that have fought for these 8 years and their officers. And he said, and some of them have not yet been paid. He said, I want you to grant them land in the frontier so that they can go and start their own lives in a brand new country. That was his request. He went home to Mount Vernon, but it didn't last very long. He realized early that the Articles of Confederation weren't going to work. They weren't strong enough. The states basically were in control, but the states had no responsibility toward the government as a whole. So if they wanted to send money to the federal government, they could. If they didn't, they didn't. If they wanted to send soldiers to protect all of the states, they could. But if they didn't want to, they didn't have to. And we found that the country wasn't working. In fact, it was going into chaos. And Washington knew it. So they wanted to get together. They wanted to have a convention, a Constitution convention, actually Articles of Confederation, and they wanted to go and fix the Article of Confederation. Washington didn't want to go. Excuse me. He didn't want to go. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. In fact, he knew that the Articles of Confederation weren't very strong, and he was for a stronger central government, but he didn't want to go. In fact, when they first came to him, he said, haven't I done enough for you people? I just want to stay home and take care of my land. But I think it was Alexander Hamilton went to him and said, we need you. He said, there's too many factions in this country and we need you. You are the only man that everybody trusts. You know what? What did God put there? An honorable man.
I bet.
An honorable man. Washington was, at the best of his ability, remained neutral in everything. He finally relented. He said he'd go. The Constitution Convention was in Philadelphia, in the same hall that the Declaration of Independence was written. In fact, before we get to there, I want to talk about the Declaration of Independence. Washington wasn't there when the Declaration of Independence was signed. Where was he? He was still general, commander of the forces. In fact, we hadn't even left Britain yet. We hadn't even declared independence from Britain. We just had a continental army to keep Britain off of our backs because they kept coming, and there was already fighting for over a year. And Washington was with the continental troops in New York. Why was he in New York? Because there were 400 ships coming into New York Harbor, and he was trying to protect New York. The country, the colonies, some of the colonies even told Washington, look, those ships are bringing commissioners of peace, and we're going to make peace with England. Washington knew better. He said, you're crazy. He said, the only thing on those ships are soldiers. Soldiers. And they're coming to put this rebellion down. He's coming to take care of us. So Washington was in New York, in the New York Harbor, trying to protect New York as the English were landing on Staten Island. He gets a letter from the men that were in Philadelphia, the ones that were writing the Declaration of Independence. He gets a letter from them. They say it's coming. Washington said, I want everybody in this city, I want every soldier here at 6 o'clock on July 9th. I have something to read to you. And they brought all the soldiers of the Continental Army, and everybody that they could met in the square. And Washington stood up, and he gave them a few words about it's time that we leave Britain. And then he read to them out loud in front of everybody the Declaration of Independence. Washington agreed with it. He said, we have to leave Britain. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. Washington grew up as a British soldier. As a British soldier, Washington had been an officer in the British Army. Now he's telling the Army of the Continentals, we have got to leave England. We have got to make our own country. And he read to them out loud the Declaration of Independence. When his soldiers heard it, there was a new surge of patriotism toward the colonies, a new surge toward America. Washington knew once they heard it that patriotism would grow. The first thing those soldiers did when they were released, they ran down in the center of town, and there's a big statue of King George III. They knocked it over. Sound familiar, Iraq? They knocked over the statue. They decapitated it. And then you know what they did a little while later? They melted that statue down and they made bullets to shoot back at the British. Washington then, I said, resigned his commission. America became a free nation. Now, they're begging Washington to come to the Constitutional Convention. He goes. He goes, and when he goes as a delegate of Virginia. And he knew going there, the first thing they were going to do was make him president of the convention, which he didn't really want to do, but he did it anyway. You know what Washington knew? He knew inside of him was the ability to run that constitutional convention and keep its eyes on the prize, the job, getting the job done. It wasn't very long when they met. You know, these men, they had to meet and they had to go against their own states and they had to go against the federal, they had to go against everything. They finally realized they're going to have to start from scratch. They're going to have to start with a new constitution. Washington was there. He voted, yes, you're going to have to do this. And they started from May to September, every day meeting, every day arguing. And Washington took a chair. They said it was a tall chair. They put it on a platform at the front of the hall, and he sat on it. And he reminds me very much of the way your grandfather, Luther, handled the church. He didn't say a lot. He didn't argue a lot. He didn't debate. He hardly ever got into debates. But what he did was he sat there, and everybody knew who was president of that constitutional convention. And everybody had respect to the man that was sitting in the chair. And all he did was when it got too rowdy, he would stand up and he'd get them quieted back down so they could go on with their business. Washington had one thing in mind, and that was to get a republic. That was to get the country started on the right foot. And he did. And when they finally, in fact, when they were arguing, they argued about the executive branch. I don't know if you know this, but at first they argued that to make the president's office for 3 men, to have 3 presidents, and they all worked together. Yeah, we know how that would have worked. But anyway, when they debated it, they had one thing in mind, that just one president unanimously. And you know what it was? They were all looking at Washington being the first president. Most of them realized that the only man that could take the job to be the first executive of this United States was sitting in that chair. And Washington, they said, we want Washington as the first president. You know what? Washington knew it. He knew it. And you know what happened when they voted on that? He refused to vote as a delegate from Virginia. He said, I'm not going to vote myself in as president. I'm not going to vote. And he didn't. They got the Constitution. The Constitution came into being. They wanted Washington as the first president. You know, if you read the original Constitution, there wasn't a whole lot about the executive office, what it entailed and what it covered. They did say, they set up that the Congress was going to handle the money, and the Senate was going to handle this, and the judicial was going to handle this, the president's office was going to handle this, but the president's office itself, they left pretty open. You know why? They were going to let Washington decide to set precedents. They wanted Washington to set precedents. You are talking about a room full of eggheads here. You are talking about a room full of patriots. You are talking about a room full of people that didn't have anything to go on for a new country other than a little bit of writing and a whole lot of prayer. Oh. And when they set it up, if you remember, Ben Franklin's the one that stood up and said, this isn't going to get done until we start to pray. And they did. And they got it done. And Washington was satisfied with it. You know, a whole lot of Washington's friends said, we don't want this. It's too much power for the federal government. But Washington saw it was needed. And he tried to convince most of his friends and did. And that's how it got ratified in the states. One that he could never convince was Patrick Henry. They were friends. Patrick Henry said it's just too much power. But Washington got it with his blessing. A lot of it got ratified, except for some of the states that said, we will not ratify it until you make sure that there are individual rights for a man. Individual rights for a man. That's why in America you have a Bill of Rights. Do you realize that you have the right to stand up against the government? Did you know that you had that individual right? That you have a right to get together with grievances? Do you know you have a right, even though it's against the United States government, to voice your opinion? Show me how many other places you have that right. Amen. That's what Washington and the convention got, the Constitutional Convention. He got it. Now he becomes president. Now he's inaugurated as the president. And we all know the oath. I swear to uphold the Constitution. What you don't know by biographers that studied this, the very end of that oath, you get 3 words: so help me God. Amen. Washington was the one that added that. He was the one that added the words, so help me God. Oh. And he said the only way that this country was going to work was that people had to be Christians. They had to be Christians. They had to be a religious people, and they had to understand that there was a power greater than them. Washington becomes president. The first time that what do we call that votes in the president? It just slipped my mind. The Electoral College. Thank you very much, Terry. The Electoral College. Back in that time, they had 2 votes each. Those that were come in for the Electoral College had 2 votes. The first one was the vote for who they wanted president. The second one was who they wanted for vice president. They found out pretty soon that didn't work very well because you got a vice president and the president didn't like each other. But the first time they did, Washington was the first and only president that got every single vote. Unanimous, overwhelming unanimous. There wasn't one vote against Washington to be president. John Adams becomes his vice president. Washington refused to belong to a party. He was not Republican. He was not Democrat. He was not a Whig. He was not any of the abolitionists. He wasn't any of them. He refused to do so. Why? Because he said your first love had to be for God. Your second love had to be for the good of this country. Not your own good, but the good of the country. And that's the way he took the job. Amen. He knew that everything he was going to do was going to set precedents for the rest of the presidents in this brand new country. Brand new, and an empire. Some of them wanted to make Washington king. Washington refused. Some of them wanted Washington to stay in the presidency as long as he could. Washington refused. He refused. He set precedent. He said, I'll be president for 2 terms, and that's it. Do you know he set that precedent? And the only one that changed it was Roosevelt. And after that, we decided to make it a constitutional amendment. Why? Because Washington had it right. They wanted to call Washington as the president all these names. Your Excellency, even Your Majesty. You know what Washington said? Oh, no, you're not going to call me that. You're going to call me Mr. President. Amen. That's it. That's it. Not even honorable. Just call me Mr. President. He set the precedent for that office. He's the one that came up with the cabinets. You know, they said Washington had a beautiful way of delegating to the right people. He put the right people in office. And once he got him in there, it was interesting. He ended up with an argument with his Secretary of State. And they had a disagreement over monies and over some of the things that were done. And that officer was Thomas Jefferson. And Washington got to the point where he thought he was going to have to remove Thomas Jefferson because they weren't agreeing. Washington tried to stay neutral as much as possible, but his first love, his first thought, his first dealings was to make sure that this country was going to start off not in debt, and it was going to start off on the right foot. And he and Jefferson had some real arguments. And then when he decided that he might have to remove him, Jefferson resigned. You know, those 2 men never spoke again after Jefferson left. Jefferson became president not many years later. And you know what, folks? That's when we went into debt. That's when the country started going into debt. But Washington led this country, set the precedent. And when it was time to leave, he resigned. He said, I will not run again. This is time for somebody else to take over. And he left. But you know what? In his in his speech that he left, his farewell speech, he warned America. He warned them. He said, you have got to keep your minds on what God wants. In his words, he said, you need to stay out of being in everybody's business. He said, you need to stay out of Europe as much as possible. You need to stay out of their wars. You need to stay out of their dealings. Yes, you trade with them, but you stay out of their politics. He said, you've got your first and only responsibility is for this country. Amen. He warned them of how to run it. And you know, for years later, they ran it on Washington's advice. They did. They stayed out. You know, when France went and had their revolution, America tried to stay out of it. They stayed out of it as much as possible. They let the French people rule France, and we stayed out of their politics. That was what Washington had for America. His sights was on. His first responsibility was to get this country started out on the right foot. You know what? I want to read to you Psalm 78, verse 72. It's talking about King David, who God put in office. God's the one that made David king. God's the one that anointed him as king. Saul, he wasn't Saul's son. God took Saul away. He lost his kingship, and God put up David instead. And this is what Psalm 78 talks about David. It says, so David fed them according to the integrity of his heart and guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. And you know what? God did the same thing with Washington. Now, when Washington finished, he went back to his home in Mount Vernon. You know, he didn't die many years later. Washington was only 67 years old when he died. God was finished. He did the work that he needed to do. He got this country started off on the right foot. He got the country started in the right direction. And then when he was finished with his work, he went home. But I want to read you something that is in the tomb of Washington. If you go look, if you go see the tomb of Washington and his family, if you go to the back of the tomb, you will see a plaque there that Washington told them that he wanted done. He told them how he wanted his tomb done. They kept Washington in Mount Vernon where his family was. They didn't put his body in Washington, D.C. He wanted it at home. He wanted it on his land. And if you go to the back of that tomb, if you look in the back, there is a plaque, and this is what is written on this plaque. It says, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. That's what Washington had put in his tomb. That's the man that God put here. That is the man, the honorable man that God put in America. And you say, why are we doing this? America, America. What happened to the mighty man? What happened to our men of war? What happened to our honorable men? You look at the election coming up and you say, where is somebody to lead our country? Well, you left the man. You left the God that gave you the honorable man. You left the God that gave you the men of war. You left the God that gave you the prophets and the captain of 50 and the captains of hundreds. That's what you left. And when you left God, he took those men back. He took those men away from you. But thank God we still have prophets and apostles in this land. Why? Because there are some still looking to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There are some of us still looking for the God that brought this country into order. There are some of us that are still looking at the man that God sent for us, the man, Jesus of Nazareth, who died for us, who was buried for us, and raised again for us. There are still some of us looking at that man. And you know what it says in Isaiah about those of us in the middle of this country that is going down? You know what God said to us about that? If you will, I'm going to finish in Isaiah 3. It says, say you to the righteous that it'll be well with him, and say them that they shall eat the fruit of their doings. But woe unto the wicked, it shall be ill with him, for the rewards of his hands shall be given him. Amen.